These weren't fancy creations, they were survival, tradition, and love on plates. We're counting down 25 forgotten meals that shaped British families. If you remember fighting over Yorkshire pudding, hit subscribe. We're uncovering meals that made Britain home. 25. Semolina pudding. In nurseries and school dining halls across Britain, semolina pudding reigned as the ultimate comfort and punishment, rolled into one creamy, lumpy spoonful. This grainy, milk-based pudding divided families like nothing else. Made from durum wheat and slowly stirred until thick, it arrived at tables with a dollop of jam, fighting to mask its bland, sometimes gritty texture. Children either loved its warming comfort or developed lifelong aversions to its peculiar consistency. For busy mothers, semolina represented reliable nutrition, cheap, filling, and packed with energy for growing children who needed sustenance more than sophisticated flavors. But some desserts required far more patience and skill. 24. Steamed suet puddings. Before ovens dominated every kitchen, British families mastered the art of steamed suet puddings, dense, warming desserts that transformed humble ingredients into Sunday treats. Wrapped in cloth and lowered into boiling water for hours, these puddings emerged golden and heavy, filled with jam, treacle, or dried fruit. The kitchen would steam like a Turkish bath while families waited for their reward. Rich, satisfying pudding that could feed a household. These puddings represented Victorian thrift elevated to art, transforming basic suet and flour into celebration food that marked special occasions and Sunday dinners throughout the empire. And speaking of thrift, families found ingenious ways to stretch expensive meat. 23. Rissoles. When meat was precious and budgets tight, rissoles became the British housewife's secret weapon. Minced meat stretched with breadcrumbs and vegetables, shaped into patties that made a little go very far. These golden brown discs sizzled in pans across Britain, crispy outside and soft within, hiding whatever leftovers or cheap cuts the family could afford. Beef, lamb, or even fish could become rissoles, bound with egg and seasoned with herbs that grew in window boxes. Rissoles embodied working-class ingenuity, proving that creativity and economy could transform scraps into proper meals that satisfied hunger and pride simultaneously. But nothing defined British family cooking quite like the next dish. 22. Shepherd's pie. Layer by layer, shepherd's pie built the foundation of British family dining, minced lamb beneath a golden mountain of mashed potatoes that crowned every proper family table. The meat layer bubbled with onions and gravy, while the potato topping turned golden under the grill, creating those coveted crispy edges that sparked sibling rivalries. Each forkful delivered comfort, savoury meat giving way to creamy potato, with gravy binding everything together. This wasn't just dinner, it was architectural achievement that stretched modest ingredients into feast, proving that British families could create abundance from simplicity, tradition from necessity. And if shepherd's pie was architecture, the next meal was pure Sunday theatre. 21. Sunday roast with Yorkshire pudding. Nothing commanded more respect in British households than Sunday roast, golden beef surrounded by Yorkshire puddings that rose like edible sculptures, declaring the week's end with proper ceremony. The kitchen became a stage where timing was everything, beef browning in the oven, while Yorkshire batter waited for precisely the right moment to hit screaming hot fat. The sizzle and rise of the puddings marked success, creating golden bowls ready to catch rivers of gravy. Sunday roast represented empire at its domestic peak, when British families could afford prime cuts and the luxury of leisurely meals that lasted hours. But not every meal was about luxury. Some were about making foreign flavours feel like home. 20. Mulligatawny soup. From the British Raj to suburban dining rooms, mulligatawny soup carried the empire home in bowls, curry-spiced broth that made exotic India familiar to British palates. This amber-coloured soup steamed with curry powder, chicken and rice, delivering warmth with just enough spice to feel adventurous without overwhelming conservative tastes. It arrived at British tables as empire made edible, bringing colonial flavours to families who'd never leave their counties. Mulligatawny represented British adaptation at its finest, transforming foreign influences into something unmistakably domestic, proving the empire lived in every soup bowl. But some influences came from much closer neighbours. 19. Welsh rarebit. Despite its name suggesting rabbit, thick, bubbling cheese sauce poured over toast, this wasn't simple cheese on toast. The sauce combined strong cheddar with beer, mustard, and egg, creating something rich and complex that transformed ordinary bread into luxury. Under the grill, it bubbled and browned. Welsh rarebit proved that British cooking could be sophisticated without being complicated, turning basic ingredients into something that felt both rustic and refined. And speaking of transforming the ordinary into something special. 18. Trifle. In cut glass bowls across Britain, trifle displayed its layered glory, sponge soaked in sherry, crowned with custard and cream that made every celebration complete. Each spoonful revealed archaeology, jam-soaked sponge giving way to rich custard, topped with whipped cream and scattered with almonds. The sherry added grown-up sophistication to what was essentially an elaborate pudding, making children feel included in adult pleasures. Trifle represented British celebration food at its most democratic, impressive enough for special occasions, yet made from ingredients every household could afford. But celebration food was luxury. Everyday eating was about different priorities. 17. Steak and kidney pie. Encased in golden pastry, steak and kidney pie delivered Britain's greatest culinary achievement. Tough cuts transformed through patient cooking into tender, gravy-rich perfection. The kidneys added their distinctive flavour to beef chunks that had simmered for hours, creating gravy so rich it seemed almost black. Beneath the pastry lid, steam escaped in fragrant clouds that announced dinner was ready throughout the house. This pie embodied British cooking philosophy. Take whatever you can afford, cook it slowly and thoroughly, and transform it into something better than the sum of its parts. And transformation was exactly what made the next dish remarkable. 16. Spotted Dick. Behind its unfortunate name lay serious pudding business. Suet pastry studded with currants, steamed until tender and served with custard that made children forget their snickering. The currants created the spots that gave this Victorian pudding its memorable name, while the suet made it rich and satisfying. Sliced thick and doused with custard, it represented winter comfort that could warm even the coldest hearts. Spotted Dick proved that British cooks understood pleasure, creating desserts that satisfied both body and soul when life offered few other indulgences. But pleasure was one thing, survival was quite another. 15. Faggots. In the Black Country and beyond, faggots represented the ultimate nose-to-tail eating, pork hearts, lungs and liver wrapped in caul fat, proving nothing went to waste in thrifty British kitchens. These rough meatballs sizzled in pans until crispy outside and tender within, their robust flavour enhanced by sage and breadcrumbs. Served with gravy and mash, they turned organ meat into family dinner that satisfied hunger and pride. Faggots embodied working-class values. Waste nothing, make everything count, and prove that good cooking could transform any ingredient into proper food. But even faggots seemed tame compared to what came next. 14. Tripe and onions. For families who understood that survival meant eating everything, tripe and onions turned cow's stomach lining into dinner, white, chewy, and utterly divisive across British dining tables. The honeycomb-textured tripe required long, slow cooking with onions until tender, creating a dish that was either beloved or reviled with no middle ground. Its unique texture and mild flavour made it cheap protein for families who couldn't afford to be squeamish. Tripe represented British pragmatism at its most extreme, proving that when money was tight, everything had value and nothing was beneath the family table. But none of these compared to the dishes that truly tested British stomachs. And speaking of meals that pushed boundaries, hit like if you've actually eaten any of these forgotten meals. Bonus points for the weirdest ones. 13. Woolton pie. When war stripped British kitchens bare, Woolton pie emerged as patriotic necessity. Vegetables layered beneath pastry, proving families could survive on turnips, carrots, and determination alone. Named after the Minister of Food, this meatless pie turned root vegetables into main course through sheer willpower and creative seasoning. The pastry provided weight while vegetables beneath struggled to deliver satisfaction that meat once guaranteed. Walton pie represented wartime Britain at its most resourceful, when families learned that survival sometimes meant calling vegetables dinner and pretending it was enough. But wartime innovations went far beyond simple vegetable pies. 12. Mock turtle soup. When real turtle became impossible to source, British cooks created mock turtle soup. Calf's head simmered until it resembled the real thing, proving ingenuity could overcome any shortage. The gelatinous texture and rich flavour fooled many palates, while herbs and wine added sophistication that disguised its humble origins. In tureen after tureen, this soup graced tables where families maintained standards despite rationing. Mock turtle soup proved that British cooking was fundamentally about adaptation, finding ways to maintain tradition even when ingredients disappeared. But adaptation sometimes meant embracing the genuinely unusual. 11. Jellied eels. In London's East End, jellied eels swam in their own natural gelatin, cold, slippery, and beloved by families who understood that the Thames provided dinner long before supermarkets existed. But this was just the beginning of London's most challenging delicacies. The eels sat in cloudy aspic, their flesh tender from slow cooking, while their natural oils solidified into jelly around them. Eaten cold with vinegar and white pepper, they provided cheap protein for families who lived by the river's rhythms. Jellied eels represented London's working-class heritage, when families took their protein where they found it and made local waters feed their children. And the Thames wasn't the only water source that provided unusual family meals. 10. Cockles and winkles. Along British coasts, families gathered shellfish from tidal pools, tiny cockles and winkles that required patience to extract but provided free protein for those who knew the tides. Armed with pins and patience, families would spend hours extracting meat from shells no bigger than buttons. The cockles provided sweet bites, while winkles required dedicated work with pins to extract their tiny, spiraled inhabitants. These seaside gatherings represented British self-sufficiency, when families could feed themselves from nature's bounty if they understood the sea's schedule. But the sea offered far stranger treasures than simple shellfish. 9. Sea kale. Before exotic vegetables filled supermarket shelves, British families foraged sea kale from coastal cliffs, blanched white stalks that grew wild and free for those brave enough to gather them. The kale grew in sand and shingle, its leaves tough but its stems tender when properly prepared. Families would venture to cliff edges armed with spades, digging up plants that provided precious vitamins when fresh vegetables were luxuries. Sea kale represented British foraging tradition, when families supplemented their diets through knowledge passed down through generations of coastal living. And foraging wasn't limited to the coast. 8. Nettle soup. In hedgerows across Britain, stinging nettles waited to become dinner. Young leaves that lost their sting when cooked, transforming from garden nuisance into nutritious soup. Armed with gloves and baskets, families harvested nettles that grew everywhere, creating soup that tasted surprisingly like spinach while providing iron and vitamins that money couldn't always buy. The cooking process neutralized the sting, leaving only nutrition. Nettle soup proved that British families could find sustenance anywhere, turning weeds into dinner through knowledge that connected them to centuries of survival. But urban families developed their own unusual protein sources. 7. Pigeon pie. In cities and countryside alike, pigeons provided free meat for families willing to catch them. Urban birds that flew straight into British pie dishes when times demanded creative protein sources. These weren't game birds from estates, but common pigeons caught in nets or trapped on rooftops. Their dark meat required slow cooking, but provided genuine protein for families who couldn't afford butcher shop prices. Pigeon pie represented urban hunting, when British families proved they could feed themselves from whatever flew, crawled, or grew within their reach. And that was nothing compared to what the truly desperate would eat. 6. Samphire. Along muddy coastlines, samphire grew in salt marshes, crisp, salty plants that became poor man's asparagus for families who knew where to look at low tide. The fleshy stems crunched with concentrated sea flavor, requiring no seasoning beyond their natural saltiness. Families would wade through marshes at low tide, gathering plants that grew where land met sea in perfect balance. Samphire represented coastal survival wisdom when families understood that the margins between land and sea provided food for those who read nature's signs, and nature provided other unlikely sources of sustenance. 5. Dandelion salad. In gardens dismissed as weeds, dandelion leaves waited to become salad, bitter greens that provided vitamins when fresh vegetables cost more than families could afford. The young leaves, picked before flowers appeared, delivered sharp flavor that cut through winter's bland root vegetables. Mixed with vinegar and maybe an egg, they created salads that reminded families that spring was coming. Dandelion salad proved that British families could find nutrition in their own backyards, turning common weeds into vital vitamins through traditional knowledge. But even weeds seemed conventional compared to the next source of family protein. 4. Rabbit stew. Before myxomatosis devastated populations, rabbits provided regular protein for British families, wild game that appeared on working-class tables as often as chicken appears today. The lean meat required careful cooking with vegetables and herbs, creating stews that stretched one rabbit into meals for entire families. Every part was used: meat for stew, bones for stock, and fur for warmth. Rabbit stew represented rural Britain's hunting tradition, when families supplemented their diets through skills that connected them directly to the land's abundance. And when rabbits became scarce, families turned to even more unusual sources. 3. Squirrel pie. During wartime and in rural areas, grey squirrels provided unexpected protein, tree-dwelling rodents that ended up in British pie dishes when traditional meat became impossible to source. The gamey meat required long, slow cooking with strong seasonings to mask its distinctive flavour. Families who overcame squeamishness found that squirrel properly prepared could feed hungry children when nothing else was available. Squirrel pie represented British adaptability at its most extreme, proving that survival could overcome any cultural taboo when children needed feeding. But at the top of forgotten family foods stood something truly symbolic. 2. Bread and dripping. After Sunday roast, precious dripping solidified into pure flavour. Beef fat spread thick on bread that turned cooking byproducts into genuine treats for British families, and the health implications would terrify modern nutritionists. The dripping carried concentrated meat essence, creating sandwiches that tasted like luxury despite costing almost nothing. Sprinkled with salt and eaten with reverence, it provided richness that transformed simple bread into indulgence. Bread and dripping embodied British thrift philosophy. Waste nothing, value everything, and find pleasure in the simplest combinations when prepared with care. But at the heart of all British family eating stood one unshakable tradition. 1. Bubble and squeak. At the centre of British family cooking stood bubble and squeak, yesterday's vegetables transformed into today's treasure, proving that British families could create magic from leftovers and love. And every family fought over their secret to perfect bubble and squeak. The cabbage and potatoes sizzled in the pan, creating the bubbling and squeaking sounds that gave this dish its perfect name. Each family had their own version, but all understood the principle: nothing was wasted, everything had value. Bubble and squeak represented everything British families believed about food: that love could transform leftovers, that tradition mattered more than fashion, and that the best meals came from making something from nothing. These forgotten meals didn't just feed families, they created the foundations of British character, teaching generations that resourcefulness, creativity, and love could overcome any shortage. Which of these forgotten dishes brings back the strongest memories? Share your family stories in the comments below. Let's keep these culinary traditions alive together. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys through Britain's incredible food heritage.